Back in the early 30s, the average man brought home about $1,500 a year, while a decent house cost around $4,000. Mortgages were short-term, interest rates steep, and jobs uncertain. You could lose your paycheck overnight. The Depression didn't just shrink dreams, it made the simple act of keeping a roof overhead feel like a victory. When the Ford V8 rolled down Main Street, folks stopped in their tracks. The lines were sleek, the rumble was smooth, and it seemed like something out of tomorrow. Same with the Chrysler Airflow. It looked like it was moving fast even when it sat still. In the 30s, a new car could still draw a crowd just by passing through town. In newsreels, you could watch steel beams rise into the sky as the Empire State Building took shape. Men in flat caps worked without harnesses, perched on girders hundreds of feet above the street. It was dizzying to see, both a symbol of ambition and a reminder that some folks were still building while others were barely hanging on. Out in farm country, you could hear them before you saw them, low, droning engines sweeping across the fields. Military planes practicing maneuvers would dip low enough to rattle windows. Kids ran out to wave, and sometimes the pilots tipped their wings back. It was as close as most small towns ever got to the sound of the modern world. 10 cents bought you a gallon of gasoline, pumped by a man in a crisp uniform who'd clean your windshield while you waited. He might check your oil or air your tires, all for free. Every fill-up came with a bit of conversation and maybe a wave as you pulled away. It wasn't just gas, it was service. New Army trucks and Jeeps rolling through town for maneuvers made heads turn. The engines rumbled, dust kicked up, and kids waved like mad. It was a reminder that the country was watching the world closely, and that the uniforms and machines you saw in the news could roll right past your front porch. By 1933, 1 in 4 Americans who wanted work couldn't find it. Over 12 million out of a job. Factories were silent, farms were dust, and bread lines stretched for blocks. But people hung on. They shared what little they had, found joy in radio nights or porch talks, and clung to the idea that somehow the hard times would pass. Every few days the Iceman would appear with a set of heavy tongs and a dripping block from his wagon. He'd hoist it into the kitchen icebox, and just like that, your milk and butter were safe for another day or two. No hum of motors, just the slow melt of ice doing the job. Riding the train meant sinking into a plush seat and watching the countryside unfold for hours. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the gentle sway of the car, and the endless view out the window made the trip feel like part of the vacation. You didn't have to think about traffic, only about where the rails would take you next. On street corners, men stood with crates of apples, selling them for a nickel apiece. Some wore coats too big, some had worn shoes, but they all had the same look in their eyes, trying to scrape together just enough for supper. People bought an apple whether they needed one or not, just to help a man get through the day. When Gone with the Wind or The Wizard of Oz hit theaters, folks lined up around the block. Seeing Technicolor for the first time was like stepping into another world. Faces were brighter, skies bluer, and it all seemed impossibly real. For a couple of hours, the Great Depression didn't exist. Only the magic flickering on the big screen. An afternoon at the ballpark meant hot sun, dusty air, and the sharp crack of a bat sending the crowd to its feet. If Babe Ruth or Lou Gehrig was at the plate, you leaned forward. They weren't just ball players. They were giants, giving people something to cheer for when the rest of life was nothing but headlines and hardship. A frosty bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents was more than a drink. It was a treat you savored. You'd fish it from a wooden cooler, water dripping down the sides, and pop the cap with that satisfying hiss. One cold gulp cut through the heat like nothing else. That nickel bought a little sweetness in a hard world. The night Orson Welles' War of the Worlds aired, some listeners swore the world was ending. The radio made it sound so real, Martians invading, cities falling, that people called police or packed their cars to flee. In the days before TV, the spoken word could stir your imagination so deeply you forgot it was just a story. When the Golden Gate Bridge first gleamed in the sun, it seemed like a dream made real. That bright red-orange span stretching over the water looked impossible, and yet there it was. People came from miles around just to walk it, marveling at the view and the feeling that the modern age had truly arrived. Sunday chicken dinners weren't fancy, but they were special. Mom would bring out the good china reserved for holidays, and the family would sit a little straighter. There'd be gravy in the boat, mashed potatoes piled high, and a pie cooling on the counter. For one meal, the week's troubles stayed outside the dining room door. 9 cents for a loaf of bread meant you could walk into the bakery and walk out with something warm, fragrant, and fresh from the oven. Bread wasn't wrapped in plastic. It was handed to you in paper, and you'd tuck it under your arm for the walk home, the smell filling the air around you. The clang of a streetcar bell was part of downtown life. They rumbled along their tracks, packed with commuters heading to work or shoppers headed home. You could step aboard for a few pennies, ride across town, and be dropped right where you needed to be. No parking, no traffic, just the steady hum of the rails. A trip to the millinery section of a department store was like walking into a garden of hats. Women would try on wide brims, tilted caps, and veiled fascinators, admiring themselves in tall mirrors. A new hat wasn't just an accessory, it was a small statement, a way to step out on Main Street with a touch of style. When Navy ships anchored in port, people would line the waterfront. The gray hulls rose like floating fortresses, and sailors in dress whites leaned on the rails. Kids stared up in awe, imagining faraway places. For a town that rarely saw the ocean's power, a warship at anchor was a sight you didn't forget. The wringer washer sat on the porch or in the basement, a big tub with rollers perched on top. You'd feed wet clothes through the wringer, careful not to get your fingers caught, then hang them on the line to dry. Laundry day was half a day's work, and the hum of a modern washer was still years away. Big band broadcasts from the Cotton Club could make your living room feel like Harlem on a Saturday night. The horn section blared, the bass thumped, and the announcer's voice cut in over the applause. Even if you'd never set foot in the club, the radio let you feel like you were sitting at one of those little tables. Before its tragic end, the Hindenburg floated over towns like a dream from the future. The massive silver airship glided silently against the clouds, dwarfing anything in the sky. People would run outside to watch, shading their eyes and pointing. A penny could still buy candy, and corner stores had jars full of it. Jawbreakers, licorice whips, and lemon drops. You'd press your nose to the glass, count your change carefully, and maybe walk out with a little paper sack. Even the walk home felt sweeter when you knew you had something good in your pocket. Getting a family portrait was an event. You'd put on your best clothes, stand still under the hot studio lights, and try not to blink. The photographer would fuss with the camera and disappear under a black cloth before snapping the shot. Weeks later, you'd have a stiff but treasured image to frame or send to relatives far away. You'd see them tacked up at the post office, War Department posters with bold letters urging folks to be ready. The images were serious, soldiers marching, flags flying. Even in peacetime, there was that reminder that the world could turn. It gave small-town life a shadow you didn't talk about much, but you felt all the same. Without electricity, the only light after sundown came from kerosene lamps. You'd set one in the middle of the table, the flame dancing inside the glass chimney. The smell of oil mixed with the sound of a turning page as you studied or read. It wasn't bright, but it was steady, and it got you through long winter nights. Evenings could go quiet, but when the radio clicked on and Roosevelt's voice came through, the whole family leaned in. His fireside chats made you feel like the president was right there in your living room, speaking plain and steady. For a few minutes, the worries outside the door faded, and hope felt just a little more possible. WPA job applications weren't glamorous, just lines on a form, but they meant hope. You might be asking for road work, a school to paint, or a park to help build. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and the pride of a real paycheck felt like a step back toward standing on your own 2 feet again. Taking the ferry into the city was an event. The boat would chug across the water, gulls crying overhead, the skyline growing taller with every minute. Cars were parked below, passengers leaned on the rail above. Before the bridges and highways took over, this was the way you arrived, with the wind in your face and anticipation in your chest. Cheap bleacher seats at a baseball game meant you were sitting on hardwood, but you didn't care. The air was full of shouts, the smell of peanuts, and the pop of a ball hitting the mitt. Kids, too, broke for tickets, would slip through a fence hole, grinning like they'd won the pennant themselves. Early in the morning, before the sun was up, you'd hear the clink of glass bottles as the milkman made his rounds. The sound echoed off the quiet houses, and you knew fresh milk was waiting on the porch. It was one of those small, steady comforts in a time when so much else was uncertain. When Joe Louis fought, the whole neighborhood listened together. Radios turned up in kitchens, on porches, even in shops. Each blow the announcer called felt like you could see it. Cheers would ripple down the street when he landed a hit. For a little while, it wasn't just his fight. In winter, families would close off most of the house and crowd into one heated room to save coal. Everyone dragged in their blankets, the radio, maybe a card table for games. You could hear the wind outside, but inside it was warm and close. Those nights brought you together in ways that lasted a lifetime. The first nylon stockings caused quite a stir when they appeared in shop windows. Smooth, sheer, and stronger than silk, they seemed almost like magic. Women stopped to look, and the lucky few who could afford them walked out smiling. In a decade of making do, something new and beautiful could turn heads on Main Street. County fairs were a yearly highlight. Livestock contests, pie-eating competitions, Ferris wheels, and the smell of frying dough drifting through the air. Neighbors you hadn't seen in months would turn up, and kids roamed free with pockets full of tickets. For a weekend, the worries of the Depression were traded for ribbons, laughter, and the taste of cotton candy. Reading The Grapes of Wrath was like holding a mirror up to the times. Steinbeck's words felt raw and familiar, families scraping by, moving in search of work, holding on to dignity when everything else was gone. It wasn't just a story. For many, it was their own life set down in black and white. Riding in a rumble seat on a sunny afternoon felt like pure freedom. The wind whipped your hair, the road stretched ahead, and you could see everything around you. It was bumpy and loud, but you didn't care. You were outside, riding in style, with the whole world rolling past at 35 miles an hour. The 1939 New York World's Fair promised the world of tomorrow, and it felt like stepping into the future. Futuristic cars, gleaming appliances, and buildings unlike anything back home. People left buzzing about what was coming. Air travel for everyone, kitchens that cooked themselves. For a moment, you could believe the hard times really might end. At night, from miles away, you could hear the lonely whistle of a train. It cut through the stillness, long and low, fading into the dark. You'd imagine where it was headed. Maybe a city you'd never seen, or a far-off coast. The sound was both comfort and longing, a reminder the world kept moving. Kick the Can was a game anyone could play. All you needed was an empty tin and enough kids to chase. You'd run until your legs burned, hiding behind bushes and fences, hearts pounding with the thrill of almost being caught. You played until the street lights blinked on, and even then you begged for one more round. Feed sacks didn't just hold grain. They became dresses, aprons, and shirts. Women picked sacks with the prettiest prints, washing and ironing the fabric before cutting it into patterns. It was thrift born of necessity, but the results were often beautiful. You learned that a little creativity could turn something plain into something worth wearing. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs wasn't just a movie. It was a marvel. The first full-length animated feature had people sitting wide-eyed in their seats. The colors, the songs, the lifelike movement. It was as if drawings had come alive. When the lights came up, you didn't just walk out. You carried that sense of wonder with you. Roadside diners began popping up along the highways, tiny silver buildings with a counter, stools, and a menu you could recite from memory. Coffee for a nickel, pie by the slice, and a waitress who called you Hon. They were a welcome sight for truckers, travelers, and anyone hungry for a hot meal on the road. A haircut at the barber shop cost $0.25, and you got more than just a trim. You got the smell of tonic, the scrape of a straight razor on your neck, and the low hum of men talking about baseball, crops, or politics. You left looking sharper and feeling caught up on the town's news. Traveling medicine shows and tent revivals brought excitement to small towns. You'd gather under the canvas to hear fiery preaching or watch a fast-talking salesman pitch his cure-all tonic. There might be music, tricks, or a bit of theater. For a night or two, the routine broke, and you left with stories, if not a miracle. The names Bonnie and Clyde weren't just headlines. They were whispered over coffee and shouted from newsstands. Stories of daring robberies, police chases, and their violent end filled the papers. In a time of hardship, their lawlessness fascinated people, even as they shook their heads. It was a tale of danger that felt far from most lives. A roll of Necco wafers or a bit o' honey candy bar was a small luxury. You'd unwrap it slowly, making each piece last as long as possible. The flavors, chalky sweet wafers or chewy honey taffy, were simple, but they stuck in your memory. In a decade where treats were rare, that little bit of sugar meant a lot. After Prohibition ended, some speakeasies went legit, turning into respectable cafes. The same back doors and hidden rooms were now open for anyone wanting a drink with dinner. Old-timers would smile knowingly over their coffee, remembering when the place poured gin under the counter and played music. Rolling your own cigarettes wasn't fancy, but it was cheap. You'd pull out a pouch of tobacco, sprinkle it on a thin paper, and roll it between your fingers until it was tight enough to smoke. The motion became second nature, something you could do without looking while talking or playing cards. Party lines meant your phone was shared with neighbors. You'd pick up the receiver and sometimes hear voices already talking. Some folks politely hung up, others quietly listened in. News traveled fast on those lines, sometimes faster than the newspaper. Urgent news traveled by telegram. You'd hand your message over, count the words carefully, everyone cost money, and then wait. When a telegram arrived, it came in an envelope stamped Western Union, handed to you by a delivery boy. Your heart always jumped before you opened it. Good or bad, telegrams rarely brought small news. Wearing a fedora and gloves to town wasn't about fashion. It was just what you did. Men tipped their hats in greeting. Women kept theirs pinned just right. Gloves were clean, pressed, and proper. You could tell a lot about a person by the way they carried themselves walking down Main Street in their Sunday best. Monopoly hit the shelves in the early 30s, and before long families were arguing over who got the top hat or the race car. Hours went by as rents were paid, fortunes made, and siblings accused each other of cheating. Kids built their own scooters from wooden crates nailed to a plank with roller skate wheels hammered underneath. They rattled down sidewalks at top speed, the front end wobbling dangerously. No helmets, no elbow pads, just scraped knees and a big grin. If the wheels came loose, you tightened them with whatever rusty bolt you could find. Chain smoking wasn't frowned on. You saw it everywhere. Office buildings, hotel lobbies, even elevators. Ashtrays overflowed on every desk, and smoke curled lazily under the high ceilings. No one talked about health risks. It was just part of the scenery, like coffee cups or calendars on the wall. In a one-room schoolhouse, every grade sat together. The teacher moved from the youngest learning their ABCs to the oldest tackling algebra, all within a few feet. The stove in the corner kept everyone warm in winter, and at recess all the kids, big and small, ran outside to play the same games on the same dusty field. When King Kong hit theaters, that giant ape climbing the Empire State Building was unlike anything you'd seen. People gasped, ducked, and held on to their seats. The mix of terror and awe was pure movie magic, and for a little while the depression outside faded into a jungle adventure playing out on the silver screen. Homemade bread came out of the oven with a crust you had to tap to believe. Spread with fresh churned butter, it was warm enough to melt in seconds. The smell filled the whole house and drifted out to the porch. Neighbors just happened to drop by around baking day, hoping for a thick slice. Shipyards and coastal towns buzzed with the clang of hammers and the flash of welding torches. Men worked side by side, shaping steel plates into the hulls of new ships. The smell of hot metal mixed with the salty air. Even in lean years, the work kept whole communities afloat, literally and figuratively. Small-town banks sometimes closed without warning, doors locked, shades drawn, savings trapped inside. People stood outside reading hastily posted signs, the reality sinking in that their money might be gone for good. It wasn't just numbers in an account. It was years of work, set aside for a rainy day that had arrived all too soon. In the heat of summer, churchgoers cooled themselves with hand-held fans, some plain, some printed with Bible verses or funeral home ads. You'd wave it slowly, keeping time with the preacher's words. The air was thick with the smell of perfume, starch, and wood polish. The fans creaked softly like 100 little windmills turning at once. When Life magazine first hit the stands in 1936, its glossy photographs seemed almost too real. You could see faces from across the country, events you'd only heard about in the news, frozen in crisp black and white. People pored over each issue, saving them in neat stacks like little time capsules of the world outside their town. Boys wore knickers with long socks pulled up to the knee, often held by garters hidden under their pant legs. The look was part tradition, part practicality, hard to tear, easy to run in. They'd come home with dust on their socks and grass stains on their knees, proof of an afternoon well spent. Putting up storm windows each winter was a family ritual. You'd haul them from the shed, wipe away last year's dust, and fit them into place before the first snow. It kept the cold winds at bay, but also gave the house a buttoned-up look, ready to hunker down until spring. Hitchhiking was common, and a cardboard sign with your destination scrawled in pencil could get you a ride in minutes. You'd stand by the road, thumb out, waving at passing cars. Most folks were happy to help, swapping stories along the way. It was part trust, part necessity, and part good old-fashioned luck. The first time you heard the Andrews Sisters on the radio, their harmonies seemed to sparkle. They rolled through kitchens and barbershops, bringing smiles even to tired faces. They sounded like pure sunshine, bright, crisp, and perfectly timed. It was music that could make you forget the troubles outside the door. When Jesse Owens won gold at the 1936 Olympics, the news crackled over radios everywhere. 4 medals, each a thumb in the eye to Hitler's ideology, made Americans beam with pride. For young athletes, it was proof that skill and heart could beat the odds. And for the rest of us, it was a badly needed victory. Making popcorn on the stove meant shaking a lidded pan over the flame until it rattled. The smell filled the kitchen, and the sound of kernels popping was like applause. You poured it into a big bowl, salted it with a practiced hand, and passed it around. Half the fun was eating it while it was still too hot. Stringing popcorn and cranberries for the Christmas tree was slow work, but it filled the room with chatter. Needles pricked your fingers, and someone always snacked on the decorations before they were hung. When the tree was lit, the garlands glowed softly, a homemade touch that felt warmer than anything you could buy in a store. Little orphan Annie ran in the newspaper, and kids followed her adventures like clockwork. You'd read the strip while your breakfast oatmeal cooled, eager to see what trouble she and Sandy had found. Her "Gee Whiskers" catchphrase slipped into everyday talk, and the cliffhangers kept you turning the page every morning. A pale lunch was standard for railroad and field workers, thick sandwiches, maybe a slice of pie, and a jar of coffee or tea. Breaks were short, so you ate where you stood, swapping a joke or two with the crew. The dented tin pail wasn't much to look at, but it carried the fuel you needed to keep going. Drugstore fountains served ice cream sodas that fizzed right to the brim. The clerk would pump in syrup, add soda water, and crown it with a scoop of ice cream that floated like a little island. You'd sit on a swivel stool, straw in hand, feeling like the richest kid in the world for a dime. WPA crews paved roads, built parks, and left behind stone walls and bridges that still stand today. Men in denim overalls worked with pickaxes and shovels, often singing or whistling between swings. Towns took pride in the projects, knowing they were more than jobs. They were improvements everyone could see and use for years to come. When Amelia Earhart made headlines, it felt like the whole country was holding its breath. A woman flying across oceans. It was bold, daring, and more than a little inspiring. Kids clipped her pictures from the paper, and some even dreamed of flying themselves. She made the sky feel a little more reachable for everyone. Summer meant finding wild blackberry bushes and coming home with purple-stained fingers. You'd eat as many as you picked, the sweet and tart bursting with every bite. The berries went into pies, jams, or just straight into a bowl with sugar. It was a treat straight from the land, free for anyone willing to look. Shoes were made to last, and a good cobbler could keep them going for years. You'd drop off a worn pair, and he'd resole the bottoms until they looked near new. The shop smelled of leather and polish, and you'd walk out feeling taller, ready to put a few more miles on them before the next repair. Ovaltine or malted milk was the go-to comfort drink, warm in winter, cold in summer. You'd stir it in until the powder vanished, then sip slow, letting that sweet, malty taste linger. Advertisements promised it would make you strong, and maybe it did. Either way, it felt like something good was happening from the inside out. Evenings on the porch swing were slow and sweet. The chains creaked in rhythm while crickets sang in the yard. A light breeze carried the smell of cut grass or rain. Nobody rushed to get inside. You just swayed, talked in low voices, and let the night settle in like an old friend. The town crier or announcer would stand in the square and read public notices, his voice carrying over the crowd. Sometimes it was news from far away, sometimes just a lost dog or an upcoming meeting. Folks paused whatever they were doing to listen, because once his words were spoken, they were the way everyone learned it. Seeing President Roosevelt ride through in an open car was something you didn't forget. He'd wave, smiling wide, the crowd waving back with handkerchiefs and hats. Even if you'd only seen him in newsreels, there was something stirring about the real man passing by. The leader you heard on the radio now just feet away. Overalls were the everyman's uniform, worn to the field, to the shop, even into town if the job called for it. They had deep pockets, brass buttons, and patches from past repairs. You wore them until the fabric thinned and the knees gave out. And even then they were good for painting, chores, or tinkering in the shed. The 4th of July meant spreading a blanket on the grass, waiting for the sky to light up. Fireworks hissed, popped, and boomed while kids squealed and pointed. The smell of gunpowder hung in the warm air, mixing with picnic food. It was a show you didn't need tickets for, just a good spot and a little patience. Fishing with a cane pole and worms was simple, slow work. You'd sit on the bank, line in the water, eyes scanning for that telltale ripple. The best part wasn't the catch. It was the quiet, the way time stretched, and the satisfaction of bringing home something you pulled from the river yourself. Flash Gordon in the Sunday comics was a ticket to another world. You'd follow his battles against Ming the Merciless, spaceships darting across the panels. The colors were bright, the action nonstop. It made the week's troubles fade for a few minutes, replaced by rocket ships, ray guns, and the promise of adventure. A tin lunchbox was built to last, hinges that clicked shut, paint that scratched but didn't crack. Inside, you might find a wrapped sandwich, an apple, and a slice of pie. The clink of the lid closing in the morning was part of the daily rhythm, right alongside the smell of coffee and the sound of boots on the floor. Outside the general store, men in fedoras and suspenders leaned over checkerboards balanced on crates. The games could stretch for hours, with moves pondered like high-stakes deals. Spectators gave quiet advice or just chewed tobacco and watched. It was competition, conversation, and community, all rolled into one shaded corner of Main Street. Sending off soldiers to National Guard training meant a crowd at the depot, handshakes, hugs, and promises to write. The train would whistle, and hats would wave until it was out of sight. Everyone knew it was just training, but there was always a little knot in your stomach until you saw them come back. The grist mill was where you went for flour, the big stone wheels turning slowly, dust floating in the air. The smell of fresh ground grain filled the place, and you could hear the steady groan of wood and stone. You'd leave with a heavy sack and the knowledge that bread was in your near future. Heating a home with a coal stove meant mornings started with the scrape of a shovel and the thud of black lumps hitting the bin. The fire glowed red, throwing off a steady heat that smelled faintly of metal and ash. You kept it going all day, knowing a warm house came only with constant feeding. Paying the utility bill meant walking across town to the company office. You'd hand over cash at the counter and maybe exchange a few words with the clerk. It wasn't fast or impersonal. It was part of the month's routine, a small errand that reminded you someone on the other end kept your lights on. Bing Crosby's Pennies from Heaven floated out of radios everywhere, his smooth voice wrapping around the melody like velvet. People hummed along while cooking, cleaning, or fixing things in the shed. Songs like that didn't just play, they stayed with you, weaving themselves into the memory of where you were when you first heard them. Women wore aprons nearly all day, frilled for company, plain for everyday work. They protected dresses from spills and flour, and pockets held everything from clothespins to recipes. An apron wasn't just clothing. It was part of the rhythm of the day, tied on in the morning and untied only when supper was cleared. Buying kerosene from the general store meant bringing your own can, the clerk pumping it by hand into the spout. The sharp smell clung to your clothes, but it was the lifeblood for lamps, heaters, and stoves. A gallon or two could see you through cold nights, or a week of cooking when the power wasn't there. Mickey Mouse in black and white still brought belly laughs. The squeaky-voiced little character could get into trouble faster than anyone, and kids howled at his antics. The cartoons were short, but they were packed with action, and no one cared they weren't in color. The magic was already there. A barn dance was as much about neighbors as music. Fiddles played, boots stomped, and the floorboards bounced under the rhythm. Lanterns glowed, pies cooled on the side table, and couples swung until their cheeks flushed. You went home, tired, dusty, and smiling, the tunes still echoing in your head. Playing horseshoes behind the general store was a test of aim and patience. The clink of metal on stake rang out across the yard, and good throws drew slow nods of respect. It was a game you could play while swapping stories, spitting tobacco, or keeping an eye on the comings and goings of Main Street. Penny arcades were a world of wonders, mechanical fortune tellers that moved their heads and dealt tiny cards, pinball machines flashing with lights. A single coin could buy a few minutes of magic, and the clatter of balls or the whir of gears felt like the height of modern entertainment. War relief tins sat on counters, their painted labels calling for donations. People dropped in pennies, nickels, whatever they could spare. You might never see where it went, but the idea that it helped someone far away made each coin feel heavier in your hand before it clinked into the box. Coal smoke on a frosty morning was a smell you didn't forget. It curled from chimneys, drifting low over quiet streets. You pull your coat tighter, breath puffing white, knowing every stove it came from meant someone was warm inside. It was the scent of winter itself in the 1930s.